Greetings, loved ones. Today we're going to talk about 7 hidden effects, trauma and complex trauma. Help us get these messages out. Please subscribe to our channel. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Hit that like button. Hit that notification bell. Give us a comment. Tell us what you think about these programs. And please share them with others because you could save a life. So let's talk about the 7 hidden effects of trauma and complex trauma, what many people do not know about trauma. We're going to start with some key points here. Many people do not know the true impacts of PTSD and complex trauma. Trauma can impact a person in several ways, creating major social, emotional, and occupational impairment. Trauma and complex trauma aren't life sentences. They are treatable with EMDR and other therapy approaches. I want you to know that trauma is a wound. We just can't see it as clearly as physical wounds. It manifests in other, more covert ways. If we understood trauma better as a society, we'd heal much quicker, and suffer less. Fortunately, the effects are treatable using EMDR therapy and other modalities, and they're not a life sentence. So here is what many do not know. Number 1, complex trauma. Many haven't heard of complex trauma, called CT. It surpasses PTSD, usually in symptom and severity. It comprises a significant difficulty with emotional regulation, relationships, self-identity, and fragmentation of the self. Although the effects of trauma are not in the events themselves, but in how the body and mind register the events. CT usually arises from traumatic events occurring in an extended and continuous fashion, usually early in life. It is usually inflicted interpersonally by humans instead of natural disasters or car accidents, often by caregivers and attachment figures who are supposed to be supportive and protective, in which the victim has virtually no chance of escaping. Number 2, psychological impact of trauma. The after effects of a traumatic experience tend to dominate the lives of most coping with diagnosable PTSD or complex trauma. The lack of connection, intrusions, avoidance, trouble concentrating, irregular sleep, and hypervigilance can become so upsetting that they create major social, emotional, and occupational impairment for most sufferers. This involuntary re-experiencing of trauma, it may be the mind's attempt to integrate and process the disturbing content toward a resolution that feels complete, emphasizing the adaptive purpose of trauma symptoms. Unfortunately, as the mind strives to resolve the traumatic event, its efforts can be counterproductive. They may cause an automatic reliving of the traumatic event that can involuntarily reproduce its most horrifying aspects and amplify one's risk for exposure to future traumatic events. Number 3, damage to the mind's information processing systems. PTSD rewires the brain's information processing system to interpret unthreatening stimuli as threatening. PTSD makes it more difficult for sufferers to attend to new or essentially non-threatening information and regulate one's attention and concentration. From an EMDR viewpoint, this is why traumatic memories are considered to be stored dysfunctionally in a disjointed and disintegrated way, separate from adaptive information and other positive experiences of self-knowledge. The disintegration of information is largely considered to be what prevents a given traumatic event from resolving naturally on its own, and what makes specific aspects of traumatic memories detached from the person's sense of self. In this sense, traumatic memories become essentially housed psychologically as timeless emotion and bodily sensation. Therefore, even years and decades later, traumatic events can have significant psychological and physiological implications. Number 4, trauma in interpersonal relationships. Trauma tends to augment our survival need for close attachment relationships with people who we care about and who are accessible and responsive and emotionally engaged. However, PTSD can erode the development and felt sense of safety and trust that promote and maintain secure attachment. Deep connection is what most helps heal from trauma, and a violation of connection is the root of trauma. What a contradicting predicament. Untreated trauma tends to weaken our bonds with others, not only in an interactional sense, but also their subjective identity and the purpose of relationships and their emotional intimacy. The toll of untreated trauma can take on relationships can generalize not only to one's immediate attachment relationships, but also to their relation to their social network and community. It can result in trauma survivors urgently craving emotional intimacy, yet recoiling from their intimate relationships at the same time. It can also become discouraging and confusing for the partners of trauma victims who are prone to experiencing helplessness and shame as they witness their partner's pain and helplessness, which is secondary trauma. And that's what we're going to talk about. Number 5, secondary trauma. Many partners, family members, and sometimes friends of trauma sufferers experience secondary trauma. Secondary trauma is when the person who has not endured the traumatic event experiences traumatic symptoms related to their loved one's traumatic experience and related symptoms. That was a mouthful. This is also why it is vital for survivors to share their experiences and their effects with their loved ones. Because trauma is in one partner reliably predicts trauma symptoms in their other partner and couples and sometimes families, and the resulting relationship distress can jeopardize even the most resilient relationships. Any form of relational distress can also worsen one's trauma symptoms. Even committed and loving couples can become susceptible to a series of feedback loops where trauma symptoms aggravate the relationship or couple distress and vice versa. Number 6, destroyed beliefs and assumptions. Although not true for all sufferers, untreated trauma can alter an individual's sense of self as deserving of compassion, honesty, and respect, and the world is fundamentally predictable, fair, and safe. Trauma can also challenge one's sense of personal agency, connection to others, identity, and overall autonomy, and can lead to powerlessness, regression to a child's state of functioning, self-doubt, and shame. And number 7 is the psychological impact of trauma. Untreated trauma can alter the functioning of the autonomic, endocrine, and central nervous systems. This can result in structural brain changes in the limbic system and hippocampus and regions that process memories and emotions. Untreated trauma can also modify the functioning of neurotransmitters responsible for regulating stress responses, epinephrine and norepinephrine. For instance, brain images show that when people diagnosed with PTSD have flashbacks, the regions linked to language and communication are inactive, which provides convincing evidence that untreated trauma can impair linguistic coding. Thus, for people struggling with PTSD, their brains may regress to a limbic system-driven state of primitive functioning, which can hinder the neocortex logical and higher order processing associated with healthy psychological functioning. All 7 symptoms and effects expounded are treatable through EMDR therapy and other therapies as mentioned. With all of this in mind, when you see someone suffering, instead of asking, what is wrong with this person, a more relevant question would be, what happened to this person? Trauma is a wound. We just can't see it as clearly as physical wounds. It manifests in other more covert ways. And if we understood trauma better as a society, we'd heal quicker and suffer less. The question is not if you will encounter a victim of violence or trauma. The question before God is, what will you do when you do encounter them? You actually could be the person who saves a life. You are called, we are all called to be champions for justice. And those who suffer violence and trauma, they need to know that those who love them and those who don't even know them will reach out to them and give them the help that they need before it's too late. If you're a victim of violence or you're suffering from trauma, I want you to listen to me. I want you to know that you are valued, you are loved, you're intelligent, and yes, 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 you are worthy. God does not want you to suffer. He wants you to live free from violence and trauma in peace and tranquility. And I want you to know that there is a way out. And it's not your fault. Abuse is not love. And most of all, listen, you are not alone. If you're a victim of violence, please reach out to someone today. If you find yourself in a dangerous situation, dial 911 for help. And if you know of anybody suffering violence or trauma, get them the help they need and inform the authorities. In our next episode, we're going to talk about reactions to trauma. Until then, God bless you.